Hi, SAS listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. I'm your host, Dave Markel. This is episode 158, and today I have the privilege and honor of introducing to you David Wood. David is a SAS listener who emailed me asking if we could discuss the possibility of him being on this show. He told me that listening to SAS has been extremely helpful to his life and that he wanted to share his experiences to help others. Obviously, our discussions worked out for him to be here, and I couldn't be more honored. I'm not going to coat David's experiences with sunshine and sugar. I'll be totally honest. David's episodes are difficult to hear, but they're also incredibly compelling, captivating, and extremely relevant to anyone who's been struggling with complex post-traumatic stress. I truly believe that you'll be glad you listened. So let's get to it. Here's David. Hey, SAS listeners. Today I'm honored to have with me someone who reached out to me via email and told me that he had been listening to the show. This is David Wood. David, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here and thanks for reaching out to me.
Thanks very much, Dave. It's a bit of a pleasure and an honour to be on your show. Maybe it won't be so pleasurable, but it's definitely, I feel honoured to be able to tell my story. And as you said, I had been listening to your podcast for a little while, and it really made a difference in my life, and being able to hear other people's stories and feel connected to community and really understand that people go through the same problems that I've gone through and overcome some horrific abuse and horrific problems to be able to live a happy life. So that's amazing.
It's so interesting to think back about your first email and what you told me about. And I think my audience is going to be intrigued and captivated by your story. Before we get into your experiences and the things that you've gone through, though, could you tell my audience about yourself? Give us some background.
I'm from Australia. I grew up on a dairy farm down in southern Australia in the state of Victoria. And I moved to that farm when I was 4 years old. I was actually born onto my grandparents' farm. And then I spent the majority of my life on that farm, and I was into farming. That's what I thought I was going to become. But I became really depressed when I was young, and I eventually basically failed out of high school, and then I milked cows for my parents for a year and got jack of that. So I went back and did my final year of high school again, and I was lucky enough to get into the university and do an arts degree, which I failed out of again. And eventually I did a writing course at a lower level institution, and I became a journalist when I was 29. And I've done that journalism on and off for the majority of my life since then. I'm 51, and I also work as a copywriter for as freelance work. And now I live in a tropical city of Darwin, which is it's only about 140,000 people, and it's much closer to Bali than it is to the rest of Australia. It's isolated, and it's in the tropics, so we have warm weather all year round. And people of a certain age would most know it from, well, not the city itself, but this is where Crocodile Dundee was filmed. Essentially, we're in the capital of the outback. It's crocodiles and cyclones, and there's 3 C's. I forget what the other one is. Maybe it's crime, but crocodiles and cyclones at the very least. Cowboys.
Yeah. Cowboys. There you go. Yeah. Do you like it there? Tell me about your personal experience and your likes or dislikes about living in the Darwin area.
It's the 3rd time I've lived in Darwin in my life. I was drawn here because it's the frontier of Australia still. Like, I guess I always say it's the place where people run to escape their lives from the rest of Australia. And there's 3 places. There's Coober or there's an island called Christmas Island, and Darwin's the only place that it's your life is salvageable. You come here and rehabilitate yourself maybe. And it's basically in Darwin, we talk about the rest of Australia as down south. So anywhere that's not Darwin or the Northern Territory is like this whole exclusion zone where people look down on them. And it's so close to Asia that it's full of, it's a very, very multicultural place. And as I said, it's surrounded by cattle stations, and it's got Australia's largest Aboriginal population, so 30% of the population is Aboriginal, and a lot of those people live in remote areas. The Northern Territory is twice the size of Texas, but only has less than 1% of the population, 10% of the population.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very big. So cattle stations here are, I'm going to, like hundreds of thousands of acres, millions of square miles. They're huge. I like it because it's laid back and it's not pretentious like the rest of Australia. I've lived in Sydney and Melbourne, and I commute a long way, and that's 18 minutes because I have to go out of town to get there. And so it's a really slow living, laid back. It's too hot to go really wild. It's got a big drinking culture. Like it's one of the biggest drinking places on earth, I'd say, and that's problematic. But I like the simplicity. I came here to heal myself. Several times I've come here to heal myself and get away from the rest of the world. And like everything's 15 minutes away. And the weather's, I hate winter, and it's hot all year round. A couple of times a year it might get below 70 degrees overnight, Fahrenheit for you people. And it sits around 90 degrees all year round. And my favourite thing about the Northern Territory is the monsoonal rains. So we have essentially a wet season and a dry season. We call it two seasons, but Aboriginal people say there's 6 seasons. So you have this massive build-up for 2 months where it just gets disgustingly hot and humid, and you're just crying out for rain, and the rain clouds will go over, but you won't get any rain. And it's called mango madness, and I think people go mad in the heat. And then you get the rain and the tropical rain while you're sitting on your balcony watching this like massive sun thunder tropical storm come through, and you're still sitting in a shirt and t-shirt, shorts and t-shirt, because it's still so hot. I love that a lot.
That is awesome.
And I love the indifference to the rest of Australia, and like the idea that you people don't know anything, and that it's just like people have to choose. Like some people are born here, but a big majority of people choose to come here to get this lifestyle. It's quite arid outside the northern, outside the city, but there's 2 of Australia's greatest national parks within. One's an hour away and one's 3 hours away, and they're magnificent. And that
I love your description. It makes me want to come to see it. I'd love to visit that. Sounds awesome and beautiful.
Waterfall, like turquoise water, the whole thing.
Wow. Yeah. And David, it's awesome to listen to you talk because you're so articulate. I can tell that you must be a great writer. I can tell from just your language, your descriptions, and it's amazing. It's awesome to hear you talk about that area. You've described it so well.
Thanks very much. That's my dairy farming education there that's coming in with my articulation. And I think one of the great things about this place is that people go to Indonesia for holidays rather than going to the rest of Australia, because it's 2.5 hours to fly to Bali, so people go for the weekend, and it's 4.5 hours to fly to Sydney. So there's that real connection there.
Wow, that's awesome. That sounds fascinating. Well, thank you for that background. David, can you tell us more about your work and what it is that you specifically do with copywriting and what your journalism work mostly focuses on?
In the week before the COVID lockdowns happened in Australia, I, with a friend, started an independent newspaper for a local businessman here. It's called the NT Independent, and we were going up against the News Corporation's the biggest newspaper company here, and we were going up against the local paper, News Corp paper that we both work for. And so at the end of our first week, we all went into shutdown, and I thought, oh, well, this has been nice for a week and it's all over now. So there's essentially 2 of us. I'm only part-time now because we don't make enough money, unfortunately. But we focus on government policy and keeping the government to account, and corruption, and a lot of our stuff is investigative journalism. And in the first 4 years, we had the government of the time, they black banned us soon after we started, so we weren't allowed to go to government press conferences or receive information from ministers or any government department. And that was the greatest advertising that could have happened for us, because it put us, we're outside the mainstream, like we're banned by government. So we've brought down the head of state here is called the chief minister, and I think we've definitely contributed to one of them losing their job, forcing them to resign over a shares scandal. And we think I take credit for bringing the other one down, and I think our reporting saw off two police commissioners who've had to resign while we've been going on. And we, for 2 years in a row, one of them, well, for 3 years in a row, really, and two of them involved me, sorry. We were nominated, shortlisted for Australia's most prestigious journalism awards, which is exceptionally hard to do as an independent newspaper when there's only two of you, because we have to do all the day-to-day stuff. We still do all the basic cop reporting and civic sort of stuff. So to find time outside of that to do investigative journalism is incredible. But yeah, there would be no other independent newspaper in the country that managed to get shortlisted twice. Unfortunately, we didn't win, but it was for our reporting on a lot of it was police reporting and on a particular coronial and criminal investigation into a police officer who shot and killed an Aboriginal man out bush during a bungled arrest. So that's the essence of what we do. Like when Labor, which is the centre-right party, was in power, we were accused of being biased against them, and all the readers, some of the readers said, you're completely biased. Why do you hate the government so much? And now we have a Conservative government in, and we get the same thing. Why are you biased against the Conservative government? And that's the way we like it. It's not good to make friends in journalism, I think. So it's kind of a little bit isolating I have my existing friends here, but I don't seek to. It's a bit hard to make friends as the journalism that we do, because you might be reporting something that they don't want reported in the future. So I don't go to the glitzy openings, and we wouldn't be invited to anyway. And we're not high society. We're a little bit underground, and we just try and keep people to account. And we've done a lot of amazing stories that have held a lot of governments and ministers and police commissioners and organisations to account.
That's amazing. Well, I want to stick out my word of congratulations. It sounds like you guys are doing a massive amount of good work. So,
yeah, well, thanks very much. I never thought I would ever be in a position mentally or have the capacity to do what I'm doing now. So I'm beholden, I'm so appreciative of my friend who dragged me along on this whirlwind of what's basically what we're doing is ridiculous. But we've managed to do it due to the generosity of the benefactor, the person who owns the paper, who's absorbed a lot of the cost over the years and kept it running when because the government black banned us, so many of the businesses here are relying on government contracts, or they're married to someone who works in the government. So we basically, for 4 years, we didn't have any advertisers because everyone was too scared to do it. So it had to be funded. And now we're subscription based. So, but yeah, my editor and friend Chris, who dragged me out of the gutter and put me out here, and what we're doing now. And as far as copywriting goes, I am right now mostly writing for a health startup that wants to test a system where you test for biomarkers and see what you're susceptible to, and then provide specialised health treatment based around what your diagnostics say. I found that an exciting concept. Yeah, and previously I worked for an artist who was based a lot in Lebanon, and I wrote a lot of his exhibition descriptions and lots of things about his art. I have no real connection to art, but I'm actually my writing outside of journalism is quite poetic. Would be the best way to describe it. It's very creative and poetic, so it fitted with the tone of what he wanted. So sometimes I wrote some things were almost poetic that were description of his art, and I really enjoyed that. And I've done things in advertising as well. But a lot of that's just to pay the bills. It pays at least 4 times more than journalism per hour, so that's what I do. And at times I have been sacked from the NT Independent before because we just ran out of money. So copywriting was the thing that came out of nowhere and kept me financially afloat until I started volunteering my time back at the paper again, and eventually Owen, the owner, said, just come back. And he just argued with his family about the cost of employing me, really.
That sounds intriguing, and it's so good to hear so much about your background. I'm appreciative of the fact that you've given us so much information, David. And I think it lends to where we're going with this conversation, because you did say that so much of what you do professionally wasn't easy, and you had to overcome quite a bit because of your memories and your issues with your past. So if we could, David, if you're ready, what are you able to tell us about your sexual assault experience? And I already know part of the answer to this. I want to warn my audience. I don't know if warn is the word. I want to inform my audience that David's approach to this is intriguing, and it's part of why I wanted him here, is to explain what it's like to be in his memory world. And so, David, I'll give it to you. Tell us about your experience.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I guess my story is a bit of a murder mystery without any death in it. In that, my life has been a search for answers to how I felt, and that's been going on since when I was about 16, and I became essentially bedridden a lot of the time with depression by the time I was 16. It took me more than 30 years to find out what was actually the cause of what was happening to me, and I've seen about 40 mental health professionals over that time in my life, in various different professions, and including a few trials of various techniques to help me, but nothing ever worked. And I think one of the messages of my story, which took me a long time to realize, is that if you're someone who's suffering from depression, and I'm using talking marks there, quotes, just don't take, even if you're seeing a psychologist, don't necessarily take people's word for what's wrong with you, and just search for answers if it doesn't make sense to you. If that doesn't make sense to you, keep on going. I obviously went through a lot of people who gave me the wrong answers, some horrifically bad answers, and I eventually got there, and I just basically dragged my ass through life trying to find it. And if what I could tell people saves them time in finding what else is wrong with them, that would be awesome. That would be awesome. So my family was quite affected, quite shut down. I grew up on my grandparents' dairy farm, and then we transitioned to my parents' dairy farm. They bought after my grandfather died a few months before I was born in 1974, and the farm had been flooded out for the second year in a row, or second in 2 or 3 years, and they basically went broke. They were swimming cows from the pasture to get milked, and my grandfather died, and my father was off in the city at times having electric shock treatment for what was an undiagnosed underactive thyroid problem. And my mother was a high school teacher, and she was from the city, and she went back to teach high school, I think, not long after I was, in the years after I was born, because they're in such a dire financial situation. And, it was a situation where it was a really conservative Catholic family. My father, from what I understand, wasn't getting paid a wage. Even when I was born, I was 33 when he was born. And they were just, going out and buying the groceries for my mother, or my father had to ask for money to buy things. There was a huge level of control that was going on there. But, my upbringing seemed completely normal to me till I left and did a lot of investigation over the years. It was a stable marriage. There was no violence. My parents weren't verbally aggressive or anything. They were caring in a way that they understood caring to be. And I think if you interacted with us, you probably would not have seen any red flags or anything that was a problem. I was really encouraged by my mother, especially, to do well at school because she was an English teacher. And my parents are really hardworking, like extremely hardworking, especially being a dairy farm. You have to work ridiculous hours. But there was also this dynamic in my family that I still can't point to properly. And I think when we talk about any sort of abuse or neglect, which is really, you can see it and you can understand why it causes damage. I think there was my family had unspoken rules and an unspoken feeling, and I had two sisters, and we were all really compliant because we knew not to speak out. And it wasn't going to end in violence or anything, but there was just this feeling that we concurred. We didn't step outside of those boundaries. We just didn't disagree with the opinions of adults. And whatever else has happened to me in my life, I think having that system where I had to depart from who I was, had to divorce myself from who I truly was because I wasn't allowed to be who I was a difficulty that made it more difficult to heal in the end, because I didn't really have my own personality. I became really shame-based. It took me years to realize how toxically shamed I was. and that basically everything I was doing in life was not really me. But I wouldn't find out about that for a very long time. Anyway, by about what you'd call grade 8, I became seriously self-conscious and a little bit paranoid, and I was sort of bedridden, as I said, by the time I was 16. But I felt like I had to become a dairy farmer. And once again, no one ever said, David, do you have to become a dairy farmer? But it was just the environment, the pressure I was around. My father had to leave school when he was 15 to become a dairy farmer. And my paternal grandmother lived about 9 miles away from us. And whenever I went to visit her, even as a child, she would say, like, why aren't you helping your father? Why aren't you milking the cows? And other farmers would come around at milking time and they'd find me in the house and say, well, why aren't you milking the cows? Why aren't you helping your father? Because my father projected this kind of desperation, I guess. He ran a relatively successful dairy farm. He kept up with technology, but there was this stuff that eked out of him and sort of spread onto me. And it was a kind of, I can't handle what's going on for me now. And I didn't quite realise what that was at the time. And then one of my teachers, when I was about 16, intervened and suggested that I go and see a psychologist, or suggested to my parents. And at that time, that was relatively unusual, being in a rural area in the early 90s. But I'm glad it happened, because it introduced me to the mental health, the world, which has been my friend and my enemy, I guess, ever since. But there's a lot of people who run into issues who don't even seek out mental health help, and that one introduced me to it early on, and it became a normalised thing for me. Anyway, I don't know. I didn't see him for very long, and I don't know why I left, but eventually I think I was just too ashamed to keep on going until I quit. I stopped that, and I eventually basically failed out of high school. You couldn't fail in that system. If you got, it was 100 you got marked out of 100, and if you got less than 10, all it said was less than 10, and I got less than 10. So the only option in my eyes was to become a dairy farming apprentice for my parents. And my father treated me better than his father treated him. There's no doubt about that. My father didn't treat me badly. It was just a really controlling environment. And I remember being so angry at him for certain things that he'd do to me. And I'd walk around when I was in the dairy practicing the anger and the rage. And I'm going to tell him this time, and I'm going to tell him exactly what I think. But my father really was the only one in our family who was allowed to be angry. So I just internalized all that and hated myself for not having the ability to tell him how I felt. But I became obsessed with breeding cows, which we had pedigree Holsteins, and that was, I think, how I adapted to the situation, because I wasn't very good with my hands. I wasn't a natural farmer. I just became obsessed, and I memorized pedigrees, and I read cow magazines, and I became amazing at knowledge of breeding cows, and all I wanted to do. I don't think there's anything I've ever wanted to do more in my life than breed cows and take cows to shows, and my father really wasn't into that anymore. And those dreams were really shut down, and I know I never would have been able to do that, because if I had stayed on the farm, I would have been controlled my entire life. Even if I had have taken over from my father and he became secondary, I'd still be under their control mentally. I don't think I ever would have matured into an adult. I milked cows for them, and then I got kicked out of my dairy farming apprenticeship within 9 months, because I was drinking heavily by that stage. It was a bit hard to drink heavily on the farm, because you had to wake up so early, and we're a fair way away from town. But when I'd go to these, I'd go for a week at a time to study dairy farming, and I'd just get drunk, and eventually they kicked me out for that, which was really good. And then I decided to go back and do my final year of high school, repeat my final year of high school. And my father, when I told him, he reminded me that how much money he'd just spent building a new dairy milking parlour for me, and it wasn't very encouraging. But I still don't know how he felt about me leaving. I don't even know how my father felt about milking cows or the life he'd chosen for himself, because those were not conversations we had. All I knew about was his politics and his religion, really. And so I went back to high school, and I went and lived in another town with my auntie to give me more space to be able to do that. I think that was my sister's idea. And but I was hideously depressed, and I could barely get out of bed. Like, I would go to bed after finishing school, and I might wake up to study, but I really struggled to comprehend things and to read. But luckily enough, I got enough marks to get into the University of Melbourne, which was one of the most prestigious universities in Australia. And I got to do an arts degree, but all I cared about was going to Newman College, which was a residential college at Melbourne Uni, which was where my sister had gone, and I guess It's a combination of Hogwarts from Harry Potter with a US college fraternity, probably would be the best way to describe it, and with a few Jesuit priests thrown in. And you had to wear an academic gown to dinner and wear a tie, and there was a lot of palaver, and there was stealing the goat from the mascot from the college next door at parties, and riding motorbikes around the quadrangle, and seriously misbehaving and drinking a lot. It was like drinking was the culture, the currency of this place. And I remember being in my room, and I might have been out drinking or partying, and the phone would ring, and it'd be my dad. And he'd just be asking me about like what to breed a particular cow to or something. And I'd pull the curtains back and it'd still be dark, and it'd be 5 o'clock in the morning, and my father was still calling me about these things where my life had completely altered. And I was lucky to have found that place because it was a completely different world from the one I had been in. But I was still hideously depressed. Sometimes I couldn't get out of bed before lunch, and maybe I'd have to go back to bed after lunch, and I basically couldn't go to classes, really. I was lucky, again, in that the rector of the college, who I disliked immensely, who was a Jesuit priest, forced me to go and see a counsellor, and I eventually saw a few of them, a psychologist. And that continued my relationship with the mental health profession and furthered my understanding of, well, it didn't further my understanding of what was going on with me, really, but I guess just the culture of having that in my life was of a benefit. I basically passed 5 subjects out of 10 that year, and I got kicked out for being an underperforming. And that was probably the most devastating thing that had happened to me at that point in my life. I loved being there. It was a magical world. And I kept on studying, sometimes part-time, for the next 4 years of that arts degree, but I got kicked out. I only passed another 2 subjects in the next 3 years. I was allowed to continue because every semester I would have to write a letter to the Board of Studies pleading my case and saying why I was allowed to be back to study. And I think those letters were so good that even though I was completely failing, they kept on letting me back in. And then one time in my 4th year, I was sitting in the corridor waiting for this Board of Studies meeting, and there was a guy sitting next to me, and I said, "Is this your first time?" And he looked at me like incredulously going, "Of course it's my first time." And I thought, yeah, well, this is about my 8th time, and probably it's time to pull a pin. And I went and filled in the discontinuation form instead and left. At that time, I was working in pubs and working in building sites as a labourer, often with my cousin for a bigger building company, and as a bricklayer's labourer as well. So I was kind of doing it hard. And then I decided just to leave Melbourne and go around Australia. So I got in my car and I drove off to drive around Australia, which took me to milking cows. I was about to milk cows on this really large dairy not far away from where I am now. And it was all American style, in barns. And I needed the money, and these American hippies turned up at the backpackers. I was staying out in a small outback town. And they said, "David, why are you milking cows? You don't want to do that. It's ridiculous. Come with us." They'd come to Uluru, Ayers Rock, for the winter solstice or some sort of ceremony. And I thought, okay, so I borrowed some money off my sister, and we got in the car and we went in the opposite direction where I wanted to go, and went to these hot springs. And then I ended up living on the beach with them for a couple of months. They imported some liquid acid from America, and they just got it out of the post box and said, "You should do some acid with us, David." And I did some acid on the beach. I don't know whether you know that alligator in Peter Pan. I was walking out, this was at night, I was walking out the beach, the tide goes out, and I saw this cartoon alligator. And I knew it didn't exist, but I thought, I better be careful, and I just bolted back to the shore. But anyway, that event made me say, I decided I wanted to be a writer, and I'm going to be a writer. So I left and I went back to Melbourne. I started a professional writing and editing course, which is at a step below university. And I didn't think I'd ever be able to study again because I was so depressed, and I was still so depressed when I was doing that. It was a 2-year course that took me 3 years to do because I continued to fail, and it was basically through the goodness of one of my lecturers that I was allowed to pass that. I was about to become the only person to ever fail that course for not having done work experience or practical placement in the writing industry. And I had 1 month to organise 2 weeks work experience. And I'd taken some cows from my parents' dairy farm to East Timor which is the country just directly above Australia, as an aid project in the months before or the year before. And I'd got interviewed by a newspaper editor, farmer's newspaper editor, one not far from where I grew up. I rang him up and said, can I have some work experience? And he let me do work experience. I think I chose journalism because I knew that person, but also because I knew journalists had to be really disciplined as writers. I had no discipline as a writer. And I think a lot of journalists will tell you that they become journalists to tell people stories and tell themselves a nice story like that. But I think often there's the shadow side of really why we do things that we do. And I would say now that I became a journalist because I wanted to feel powerful. And my current psychologist told me that I perhaps do it because I can fight for people, the underdog, when I wasn't allowed to fight for myself. Like I wouldn't allow me to stand up for myself, but this was an outlet to do that in. So I became a journalist on a farmer's paper, and I stayed at that newspaper company for 5 years. And I rose up the ranks and I went to the daily paper and I became the chief of staff of the daily paper.
Wow.
Before I got sacked once again. But I was depressed, horrifically depressed during that time, and I could barely drag myself to work most of the time, and I drank to cope. I spent a lot of time really drunk to try and deal with that. I didn't know why I was sacked at the time. I think it was unfair still, but my ability to not function properly contributed to that. And the reason why I hadn't left is I was so full of shame and so depressed that I thought I can never get another job. There's just no way. So once again, being sacked was a good thing for me because it just forced me out the door. And I got a part-time job with a friend in another area in a crappy little newspaper that I didn't like very much. And then my uncle said, do you want to run the dairy farm in East Timor on a paid volunteer basis? Because it's floundering. And I thought, yeah, I'd love to do that. I hadn't secret to myself, I didn't say these words out loud, but I have no capacity to do that. There's just no way I will be able to make that work. It's like as in stabilising the project because I couldn't function. But I did it anyway, selfishly. But I wanted to go away. I wanted to go away somewhere remote and give myself time and space to heal. And I think that was probably the first real stepping stone to getting me where I am today, because I went out onto this agricultural school, lived with some priests, ironically, and it was 110 miles from the capital of Dili, but it was 6 hours to drive there. And I had a motorbike and I could do it in 5 if I drove really dangerously. I didn't function very well, but it was okay because that place didn't function very well either. So even if I had been highly effective, I doubt it would have worked out anyway. Although I was depressed and I couldn't feel the joy and I spent a lot of time in bed, I still loved being there because it was exciting and it was different and it took me out of the pressure of the Western world. And it was a few years after the Indonesia had left, after they'd occupied the country for 25 years and they'd ransacked the place on the way out and it was still getting back on its feet. And I'd been there in the couple of years after the Americans had left and the UN had come in, and that's when I took the cows there. I ended up being driven by these Australians to the handover from the UN. The UN handed the country back to the people at this place called Tosi Tolu. And I'd remember drinking in this bar owned by a New Zealander, and he was serving caviar on toast to everyone as celebration. And I actually got into the actual ceremony because these Portuguese military smuggled us in the back of their trucks. And I felt a bit bad that I got to go when there was people back where I was living in the other part of Timor didn't get to go. But, it was fascinating. And then 10 years later, as a journalist, I got flown back for the government where I was living to cover the 10-year anniversary. So I got to replicate that again. I remember I got a lift after the ceremony the next day. I got a lift halfway back to where I lived. And I thought, I'll be able to hitchhike back. There's plenty of UN vehicles and stuff like that. And no one was picking me up. And I sort of walked too far to walk back again. And this little van pulled up and the guy in the front seat couldn't speak English. But the driver said, this is the village chief and he wants to pick you up and take you where you need to go. And they took me as far as where their village was, which was still a fair way from where I lived. And that night I saw the unveiling. They had a flag. All the different districts were given a flag, New Timorese flag, and I got to watch them unveil their country's flag for the first time while we drank Victoria bitter from Australia, which is what the village chief who said it was a militia in the resistance said he used to drink in the field when he was fighting the Indonesians, saying, I never drank water, I only ever drank VB. So that was interesting. So I loved being in Timor. There was this place called Hotel Dili. I read this book called Travels with My Aunt when I was a kid, and it was about European travel from memory. And walking into Hotel Dili, it just felt like it was this vortex, this connection to everywhere in the world. And there was people from all around the world. And when you went, sat in this cafe and just thought, this is what I want for my life. I want to travel and I want to be part of the whole energy of the world. And that was an amazing feeling I'll never forget. But eventually I got medevaced out of the country because I couldn't function anymore. I went to Darwin, where I now live, which is the closest place in Australia to East Timor. And the volunteer organisation just sort of dumped me there and said, oh, well, there you go. Have some medical tests, which they didn't pay for, and they didn't provide me with any accommodation, and I stayed with friends. And I realised that I couldn't keep on going like that, so I got a job. There was a job going with the local newspaper. I walked in, and all I had was my farmer's clothes, really, from being a farmer in East Timor, pretty ragged clothes. And I walked in there, and they gave me the job. I started being a journalist there. I realised now that I couldn't finish sentences. My brain capacity at that stage meant that I couldn't finish sentences and I couldn't do cause and effect. So I couldn't quite, if politicians announced a government policy, I couldn't kind of see how it would work or what the negatives would be. But I got to be a political reporter anyway, even though I couldn't actually think properly, which was obviously a problem, but that's how it was. But this newspaper was also, I call it the bearded lady of Australian newspapers, because it wrote about UFOs invading towns and yowies eating dogs. Yowies are like an Australian equivalent of a Bigfoot. And stories about we're the only jurisdiction in the country that still allows fireworks once a year for our Independence Day. There's a story about a guy who stuck fireworks up his bum and lit them on fire and ended up in hospital. The frivolity of all that. It was my happy place, and I fitted in really, really well there because it was a fun place to work. But I was still savagely depressed, and I got really, really drunk soon after getting there, and I woke up feeling really bad, and I thought, I need to do something about this. I need to find the answer to what's wrong with me. And I committed to going I'm going to work this out. And I thought, naively, I'm going to work this out, and I'm going to work out a step-by-step guide about how to cure depression, and I'm going to write a book about it. And I forgot in that part of my plan that I couldn't actually write outside of being a journalist. There was no way I could write or string sentences together properly, so that wasn't going to work. And I ended up seeing a psychiatrist who told me I didn't have depression, I was just anxious. But he couldn't come up with any way to stop me being anxious. But I did then go and see a psychologist who grew up in India and written his master's thesis on using meditation and using Eastern philosophies in curing in the psychology of the Western world. And he introduced me to meditation, which was a really good thing to happen in my life. It didn't help me straight away. Well, it helped me. It didn't cure me, but it was an important step in my life. And also at that time, I started reading this book by an Australian guy called Russ Harris called The Happiness Trap. And he suggested you name your unconscious so you could talk to it. And I named my unconscious Sunflower, which was the first calf I'd ever had and ever taken to a show when I was 4 years old. Since then, I decided I was going to name a book I wrote called The Madness of Sunflower and Why It'd Been Trying to Kill Me. But I realise now my unconscious has been trying to save me. And the analogy I had was when I was 4 years old, I was teaching this calf how to lead to train it to go to the show. And it ran away and it dragged me. It dragged me and I didn't let go of the halter, and it dragged me through the gravel and it cut me up. And I cried and decided not to take the calf to the show. And the analogy was that my unconscious had been dragging me through the gravel for my whole life. And I just didn't know I could let go of it all and get on with my life. Unfortunately, I still didn't know what was wrong with me. And then I developed a hyperactive thyroid and it became really thin, and I started having panic attacks and I couldn't walk properly because I was too thin. And I got treatment for that. And I thought, oh, this is the answer. It's been my thyroid the whole time. This is what's wrong with me. And I got treatment for that, and I realised, well, that's not actually what the cure is. And having read, I think someone suggested on your podcast recently, Nadine Harris, in a book called The Deepest Well, about ACE scores and the childhood trauma on your biology. And I presume like that was an autoimmune disease, and I presume that may have happened because of what had happened to me previously in life. And around that time, my cousin, who was one of my best friends and the same age as me, he was cropping and running beef cows right on the edge of Melbourne, all these developers' land that you couldn't build on, and they had to have farming done on them for tax purposes. And he said, "Come down and be a labourer," because I told him how I was struggling. So I decided to leave journalism, and it was a huge, massive ego blow. Didn't foresee how intertwined in my identity it had become. But certainly, before I went there, I just thought, I'm going to go down there and I'm going to kill myself. I don't think I have any options. But I went down there and I gave it a crack. I didn't kill myself, but I didn't get better. I got worse. And I spent a year feeding cows, driving around various farms on the edge of Melbourne. It was my dream when I was a teenager or when I was in my 20s. All I wanted was a dairy farm on the edge of Melbourne so I could have the best of both worlds. I could have the city life and I could do what I was passionate about. And this was an old dairy farm, and I thought, if there's nothing more that I can do in my life, I will turn this into a small boutique dairy and I'll sell milk and I'll have at least a half-decent life. But I was incapable of doing that, and after about 11 months, I couldn't work anymore, really. Like, I got to the point where I can't even get out of bed to feed cows anymore. And then there's this national not-for-profit mental health research and treatment centre called Black Dog Institute in Sydney, and they were doing ketamine trials. I signed up for that, and that got scrapped, unfortunately. But they asked me whether I wanted to do a transcranial direct current system where it's like a mild electric shock. And I thought, yeah, I'll do that. Like, I wanted to do anything. I would do anything to fix myself. And it meant moving to Sydney for 2 months. So I just got on my motorbike, which is all I had. I'd actually ridden from Darwin to Melbourne to relocate on a motorbike, which is, I don't know, probably 3,000 miles or something like that. And I went to Sydney, and I really didn't have any money, and I was just crashing with friends and doing this trial. And about that time, my cousin split up his business. He was in business with this other farmer, and he transferred everything to this other farmer. And this farmer took on all the debt, and the debt was huge. And they owed me about $15,000, which was, I think I probably had $3,000 to my name or less. And I didn't think I could ever get a job again, and $15,000 was a lot of money to me. But the farmer went bankrupt, and he said, no, that money doesn't exist anymore. And my cousin had been an agribusiness banker, and he knew intimately farming finance. And he'd said to me before that I don't think Alan, who is his business partner, when he goes to refinance everything, I don't think he's going to get refinanced. He's going to go bankrupt. And then my cousin had signed over all this assets to this guy, and he did go bankrupt. So I think my cousin knew that he was going to go bankrupt. And when I asked him to help me out with the money, he just said, "No, it's not my problem. It's Alan's problem. He's the one that should be paying you." So here I was, desperately depressed. The transcranial direct current didn't help. Like, it wasn't changing my state. And I was on a bus one day. I was seriously about to get the forms to go on a disability pension, and I just happened to be on a bus, and I don't know how I got speaking to a random stranger, but I was talking to him about it. He said, I was on a disability pension and I wouldn't do it because it's really hard on the other side to ever get a job again. And I had no idea what I was going to do. But one of my friends, there was two things. One of my friends told me at the time, said, "David, you need to treat healing like it's a full-time job, just what you have to do." And the other thing is that I'd heard this YouTube video with this other American researcher who'd gone into panic attacks. I forget what his name is now. And he said, "I vowed never to turn away from the pain again." And I said, "Okay, I'm never going to turn away from the pain again. I'm just going to feel it all." And through luck, I got a job for the community section on one of Sydney's major newspapers as a digital producer. And I started that job. And that got me a job that I thought was never going to ever happen again. And I'd already decided that I was going to stay in Sydney no matter what it took. Like, this was the biggest, meanest town in Australia, and I was not going to go back to the farm because I knew I wanted more. I knew I didn't want to give up, and I didn't want to just rot, or whatever was going to happen to me. I didn't want that. And I had no idea how I was going to make it all happen. But I got this job that was like the foothold to having an income, and I did another trial with the Black Dog Institute for another few months, and that didn't help me. But it did introduce me to the concept of, they said, treatment-resistant depression, which that's apparently what I had, which is one of the most arrogant things I could ever think a medical professional could tell you. Like, you have treatment-resistant depression. I thought, well, maybe the treatment I've been getting isn't the right treatment. Did you ever think of that? And I'd been on antidepressants before, like 7 different antidepressants. When I was about 23, 25, and I went on Zoloft. My psychiatrist put me on Zoloft, and I couldn't get an erection. It was like really just distressing, and if I wanted to have sex, I had to go off the drug for a couple of days. But I know anyone who has ever taken SSRIs, you get these awful brain zaps if you don't take them for a couple of days. And that was my psychiatrist's long-term treatment option for a 25-year-old man, was to go, you're going to take these drugs and you're not going to sexually function anymore. And that was, I guess it was one of the first indications of me about the problems in the mental health field that I encountered. And I'm not going to give medical advice, and people can do whatever they want to. But in the last couple of years, I've read a book called The Emperor's New Drugs, where a placebo researcher in America was researching placebos. He went and, through freedom of information, got all the drug trials for 6 different drugs. And he did a meta-analysis of them and decided that basically they were clinically insignificant in their ability to treat depression, except for really severe depression, they worked a little bit better. And then that book detailed how the idea of a chemical imbalance, which I got told when I was 23 I had, and that was the reason for my depression, it wasn't backed by science either. Like, there wasn't research that showed that. And I think that was, there was plenty of disagreement about how he went about his research when that book came out. But I was looking recently about it, and the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners has said that the serotonin theory of depression is not supported by scientific evidence and calls into question the basis for the use of antidepressants. And I think more broadly, it's the biological. I don't discount the biological genetic basis for what happens to people or how they potentially respond to trauma, or that they become depressed or anything like that. But I also think there's this problematization or medicalization of things that are more about love, just not having enough love when you're a child. And the mental health system has become so disconnected from that human emotional element of why we're in pain in the first place. And maybe there's that Rene Descartes, the separation of mind and body in the 1600s. And it seems like most of the early psychological treatment I went through was just telling me, these are your bad thoughts and you need to think in a different way. And I think maybe there's a reliance on keeping things at a level of talking and thinking about thought patterns and thoughts instead of exploring why those thoughts are there in the first place. And I don't even like the term mental health anyway, because I don't think it fully, in my experience, it doesn't fully encapture really what we're talking about. Like, it's I don't have a good term, but a neuro-emotional health or a life print well-being is one that ChatGPT came up with for us. And I think if we started to examine really what causes these so-called illnesses, we'd have to have serious questions to ask about society in general and things that perhaps we don't want to admit. And my experience of healing is it's a slow progress to be able to feel. And those symptoms, even depression, are trying to tell you something about your body. And antidepressants can numb and blunt those feelings. And if I think I had stayed on them, I never would have got to where I am today. And I've read a book, which I'm rereading, called The Tao of Fully Feeling by a guy called Pete Walker. He's a psychologist, and he recounts his own complex PTSD from childhood. And on his website, he says that renowned traumatologist John Breen is said to equip that if complex PTSD was ever given its due, that if ever the role of dysfunctional parenting in adult psychological disorders was fully recognised, then the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders would just become a pamphlet, not like the Bible size book it is today, and that all these disorders come out of this place. And I often see some of these diagnoses and think that's just bizarre. Like, it seems like this grand delusion about exactly what all this really is. And to me, this is simplifying it, and this is just an overview of my thoughts, but to me, so much of why people struggle and what we call mental ill health or disorders or diseases even is about lack of love and a lack of having a witness to what you are as a child and normalizing all that. And being in the mental health field, the mental health industry thinks that being loving or like being really affectionate is unprofessionally inappropriate. And having seen psychiatrists before, I think my experience seemed like it's antithetical to the whole idea of hearing trauma and being in a situation like that. And I don't mean any of these mental health practitioners meant me any harm or were not highly trained, and that they weren't on the whole nice and caring people. But I think broadly the overall construct of how we view mental health and how it's taught is a little bit demented, and it's like kind of seems to me like a denial or avoidance system developed in this particular field of inquiry because the truth might be too unpalatable, you know? My current psychologist is from Uruguay, and there's that South American culture is a little bit different to the Australian, the British, the Irish culture, and I think that affection and more demonstrative show of affection and love even is particularly what I needed because I came from more of a cold, sterile sort of English upbringing where it was all about thoughts and it was not about emotion. Anyway, that's my little bit of a rant, actually. You might need to get me back on track.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I think you'll agree with me that this has been an extremely compelling listen, and I can't thank David enough for being a guest with me. But obviously there's more, and I don't want you to miss it. Tune in next week as I bring you part 2 of David's compelling story. It only gets better. As always, I'm grateful to you, my listeners, for showing up, for leaning into these conversations, and for helping me continue to normalize the discussion around rape and sexual assault and helping bring justice to victims and survivors. Please keep sharing these episodes, keep talking about them, and keep believing victims and survivors. Because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week. Hi, SAS listeners. Thanks for staying with me for a few extra minutes. I want to take this opportunity to remind you about Kennedy Alley and her 100-mile challenge coming up on October 18th. Starting on that day, Kennedy will be running her very first 100-mile race. Kennedy is dedicating every single mile to survivors of sexual assault and rape, and she's doing it to raise funds for the Domestic Violence Intervention Services Sex Assault Nurse Examiner Department in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For those of you who may not know, SANE nurses and victim advocates are often among the very first people a survivor encounters after an assault. That first response matters. It can either help a survivor move towards healing, or it can deepen their trauma. The work these nurses and advocates do is extraordinary. They bring empathy, compassion, and a trauma-informed response to crisis situations most people can't even imagine carrying. As a survivor herself, Kennedy wants to acknowledge and honor their contribution to the recovery process by tying her 100-mile run directly to the fundraising for them, because their impact ripples forward in the lives of every survivor they serve. Kennedy's message is simple but powerful. Start by believing. Believe survivors. Listen to their stories and respond with compassion and trauma-informed care. When we do that, we create an environment where healing becomes possible and where survivors are empowered rather than dismissed. Let me close with this request. Please seriously consider helping Kennedy's cause with a donation if it's something you can do. And if it's not, that's okay. If you do decide to donate, you'll find Kennedy's GoFundMe link in this week's episode notes. And please know that Kennedy and I thank you for your support.